Homeownership was supposed to be a dream. For years I had worked long hours, saved every spare penny, and dreamed of living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the grass was green, the sidewalks were clean, and the neighbors waved as you walked by. When I finally bought my home in Lakeside Meadows, I believed I had found exactly that. The manicured lawns, the freshly painted fences, and the well-kept streets were all managed under the watchful eye of the Homeowners Association, the HOA. At the time, I thought that was a good thing. I should have known better. It all started with something so small, so insignificant, that most people wouldn't have given it a second thought. A flower pot. A single hand-painted flower pot my daughter had made for me one summer afternoon. She was proud of it. She had spent hours carefully painting little daisies and sunflowers around the rim, and I placed it on the front porch so that every time I came home I could see it. It was a small reminder of what really mattered: family, love, and the home we had built together. But the HOA saw it differently. One morning, a letter appeared in my mailbox. It was typed on official HOA letterhead, complete with a threatening tone and a citation number. According to them, the flower pot was non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. They claimed it clashed with the neighborhood's uniform look, and they issued me a fine of $100 per day until it was removed. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Surely no one could be so petty as to fine a homeowner over a flower pot painted by a child. But it wasn't a mistake. The fines started rolling in, daily, each one more aggressive than the last. I calculated the numbers, and within a week, they had charged me $700. In a month, $3,000, and they showed no signs of stopping. I tried appealing the deceit. Scion. I sent letters. I called the board. I even attended one of their meetings, sitting quietly as they smugly dismissed me, waving away my concerns with a few words about rules being rules. They didn't care about my daughter's flower pot. They didn't care about reason or compassion. All they cared about was control. That's when I started to notice other things. The HOA wasn't just strict. They were cruel. One neighbor was fined because his grass was half an inch taller than regulation. Another was forced to repaint her house because the shade of beige she chose was deemed too warm. Families were fined for leaving trash cans out for more than 2 hours after pickup. People whispered about board members abusing their power, targeting certain residents while conveniently ignoring their friends' infractions. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice. It was about money and power. The flower pot fines continued. I received notice after notice, the amount stacking higher and higher. By the second month, the HOA claimed I owed them over $6,000. They threatened to put a lien on my house, to drag me into court, even to start foreclosure proceedings if I didn't comply. That's when something in me snapped. I wasn't just dealing with petty people anymore. I was dealing with bullies, people who thrived on control, who got satisfaction from making others miserable. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's bullies. I took the flower pot inside, but not because they told me to. I did it because I wanted to look at it every single day as a reminder of why I was about to do what I did next. You see, I wasn't just a homeowner. I wasn't just some random guy they could push around. I had resources they didn't know about. Investments, savings, business experience. And most importantly, I had the kind of stubbornness that doesn't back down from a fight. And the HOAT, they had the upper hand. They thought I would fold under the pressure, pay their ridiculous fines, and crawl away defeated. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just planning to fight back. I was planning to take everything from them. I started doing research. I dug into the HOA's bylaws, their financial statements, their meeting minutes. What I found was shocking. Mismanagement, overspending, questionable payments to board members. And beneath it all, a simple truth. The HOA wasn't as untouchable as they pretended to be. Every HOA is essentially a corporation, with shares divided among homeowners. And shares can be bought. Power can shift. Control can change hands. All it takes is the right strategy and enough money. And I had both. As the fines piled higher, as the board members smirked at me during meetings, as the threatening letters filled my mailbox, I kept quiet. I played the part of the frustrated homeowner, beaten down by the system. But behind the scenes, I was planning, calculating, buying. Because if they wanted to play games over a flower pot, then I was going to end the game altogether. And I knew exactly how I was going to do it. The seed of revenge had already been planted, but like all things worth doing, it needed time, patience, and precision to grow. I wasn't going to confront the HOA head-on, not yet. That would only give them a chance to circle their wagons and paint me as the problem. No, I needed to dismantle them from within, brick by brick, until the entire structure came crashing down on their smug heads. My first step was research. Not casual browsing, but a deep dive into the machinery that powered the Homeowners Association. Most of my neighbors thought of the HOA as some shadowy, untouchable board that appeared once a month to issue fines and hand down rules. But the truth was simpler. It was a corporation. A non-profit, yes, but one structured, like any other organization, governed by bylaws and operated by people who were supposed to be accountable to the homeowners. What I discovered was that every homeowner in Lakeside Meadows was, technically, a shareholder. We paid dues, we were subject to their rules, and in return, we had the right to vote on board members, budgets, and amendments. The problem was, most people didn't care enough to get involved. They hated the HOA, but they didn't have the time or energy to fight. That's what gave the board their power. Apathy. But I wasn't apathetic anymore. I was angry. I read every line of the bylaws, every dusty amendment, every clause written in legal jargon. I studied the financial statements they mailed out once a year, the ones most residents tossed in the trash without reading. What I found made me grit my teeth. Thousands of dollars in administrative fees paid to companies owned by board members. Landscaping contracts that were overpriced by tens of thousands, conveniently awarded to a cousin of the HOA president, and reserves that were dwindling far faster than they should have been. They weren't just bullies, they were thieves. That's when the plan took shape. I couldn't just fight them over the flower pot. That battle was too small. But if I could gain influence, if I could take control of the board itself, I could end all of it. No more petty fines, no more power-hungry tyrants, and best of all, I could humiliate the very people who thought they were untouchable. Step 1 was alliances. I started talking to my neighbors, not openly, not in a way that would tip off the board, but casually. On morning walks, during trips to the mailbox, while watering the lawn. I asked how they felt about the HOA, and what I heard was a chorus of frustration. Fines for trivial things, inspections that felt more like harassment, rules that shifted whenever it suited the beau. People were tired of it. They felt powerless. I became the sympathetic ear, the neighbor who understood. I didn't pitch my plan outright. Not yet. Instead, I planted small seeds of doubt about the HOA, the kind that would take root over time. Step 2 was resources. The HOA had money, but so did I. They didn't know it, but years of smart investments had given me a financial cushion far larger than most people would assume. Enough, in fact, to buy delinquent properties. You see, when homeowners failed to pay their dues or racked up too many fines, the HOA often foreclosed on their homes. Those properties were then auctioned, sometimes for shockingly low prices. And who was there to buy them? Usually investors from outside the neighborhood, people who didn't care about the community. But I saw an opportunity. Every house I purchased wasn't just an investment. It was another share in the HOA, another vote, another step toward control. Step 3 was patience. I knew I couldn't rush this. The board was arrogant, but they weren't stupid. If they suspected I was organizing against them, they'd fight back hard. so I kept quiet. I paid the ridiculous fines they claimed I owed, at least on paper. I nodded politely at meetings, even as they sneered at me. I played the role of the frustrated, defeated homeowner, all while tightening the noose. And then came step 4, timing. HOAs run on election cycles, just like any other board. Every year, a few seats opened up. Most residents didn't bother to vote, which meant the incumbents were re-elected without effort. But what if just once the homeowners actually showed up? What if they had someone to rally behind, someone who promised to end the fines, to bring transparency, to restore fairness? That someone would be me. As the weeks turned into months, the fines over the flower pot ballooned into astronomical numbers, tens of thousands of dollars on paper. The board assumed they had broken me. But what they didn't realize was that every letter they sent, every dollar they demanded, every sneer they threw my way only fueled my determination. Behind closed doors, I was building an empire. I bought 3 properties in foreclosure, each one giving me another vote in the HOA. I quietly gathered signatures from neighbors who were sick of the board's corruption. I combed through their financials and documented every shady payment, every conflict of interest, every suspicious transaction. And when the annual election finally came around, I was ready. But this wasn't just about winning a seat on the board. This was about complete control, about tearing down the very people who had thought they could bully me into submission. The board thought they had the upper hand, but what they didn't know was that the ground beneath their feet was already crumbling. Because I wasn't just going to fight the HOA, I was going to own it. By the time the annual HOA election rolled around, I had everything lined up like dominoes, waiting for the final push. For months, I had played the role of the quiet, frustrated homeowner who had given up the fight. I nodded at the board's arrogance, paid their bogus fines in appearance, and acted as though I had been broken down by their petty rules. But behind that mask, I had been building my army. It started small. A conversation at the mailbox with Mrs. Turner, who had been fined $500 because her shutters were fading. A chat on the sidewalk with the Johnsons, who had been threatened with foreclosure for leaving their trash cans out overnight. Then there was the Harris family, forced to repaint their home at their own expense because the shade of beige they chose was 2 shades too dark. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a grudge. And everyone thought they were alone. That was the board's greatest weapon: isolation. They convinced people that resistance was futile, that no one else cared in us, to fight. But once my neighbors started realizing they weren't alone, that dozens of us had been harassed, fined, and bullied, they began to see what I already knew. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood, it was strangling it. So I positioned myself as the solution. I didn't make grand speeches or loud promises. That would have tipped off the board too soon. Instead, I listened. I sympathized. And slowly, quietly, I became the one person people trusted to stand up for them. The day of the election arrived like any other, but beneath the surface, tension was brewing. The HOA held its annual meeting in the community center, a bland, beige building that mirrored their obsession with uniformity. Usually, only a handful of homeowners showed up, maybe 20 out of 200. The board counted on apathy to keep themselves in power. But this year was different. By the time the meeting started, the room was packed. Nearly every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls. The board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly not expecting this kind of turnout. They tried to brush it off, pretending everything was business as usual, but the cracks were already showing. When it came time for nominations, the board smugly nominated themselves, expecting the same routine re-election. That's when I stood up. The room went silent, and every pair of eyes turned to me. Calmly, I announced my candidacy for the open seat. I could see the shock ripple across the board members' faces. They hadn't expected me to show up, much less challenge them. To them, I was just the guy with the flower pot fine, a nuisance easily crushed. But now, I was standing there as their opponent, and they realized, maybe for the first time, that I wasn't going away. The voting began. Normally, only a few people bothered to cast ballots, but this time, nearly the entire room participated. I had already secured proxies from homeowners who couldn't attend, giving me dozens of votes before the ballots were even counted. The board members shifted uncomfortably as the tally grew, the numbers swinging in my favor. When the results were announced, I had won the seat by a landslide. The room erupted in cheers, neighbors clapping and smiling as if they had finally broken free from a long shadow. For the first time, the board realized they weren't invincible.
Think about what you're saying.
But this was just the beginning.
I know,
One seat wasn't enough.
It's just so frustrating
My
sometimes.
plan wasn't to sit quietly at their table and be outvoted on every issue. My plan was to take over, to dismantle the system they had built on fear and greed, and I knew exactly how to do it. You see, while the board celebrated their remaining power, I held another card they didn't know about. I had quietly purchased 3 foreclosed properties in the neighborhood, each one giving me additional votes in the association. That meant I didn't just represent myself, I represented 4 households, 4 votes, 4 voices. And as the newest board member, I had access to information the average homeowner didn't. The financial records told a damning story. Misuse of funds, contracts awarded to family members, exorbitant administrative costs that made no sense. They had been siphoning money from the community for years, hiding behind layers of bureaucracy. And now, I had the evidence to prove it. I didn't reveal everything at once. Timing was key. If I dumped all the information on the table immediately, they'd circle the wagons and fight tooth and nail. Instead, I bided my time. I learned their weaknesses, their patterns, their alliances. I let them believe they still had control. All the while, I quietly rallied more neighbors, showing them the truth, piece by piece. The tide was turning. What started as one man fighting over a flower pot had become a movement. Homeowners who once felt powerless now felt emboldened. They attended meetings. They demanded answers. They voted. The board began to fracture. Some members grew defensive. Others panicked, and a few even tried to distance themselves from the corruption they had once embraced. Their unity crumbled, and with it, their grip on power. By the next election cycle, 2 more seats were up for grabs. This time, I didn't stand alone. I encouraged 2 trusted neighbors to run, and with the momentum we had built, they won easily. Suddenly, the balance of power had shifted. The once dominant board was outnumbered, their influence shrinking by the day. But my plan wasn't complete yet. Winning seats was only part of it. The ultimate goal was to own the HOA outright, to take the very system they had used to bully us and turn it against them. And soon, I would have the chance to do exactly that. Winning a seat on the HOA board had been my first victory, but it wasn't the end game. It was just the opening move in a much larger strategy. From that moment on, every step I took was calculated to weaken the board's grip on power and to position myself as the inevitable force they couldn't stop. Inside the board meetings, the atmosphere shifted. Once, the members had sat smug and untouchable, but now every agenda item became a battlefield. I brought questions they couldn't answer. I presented documents they hadn't expected anyone to read. I called out irregularities in contracts, fees, and enforcement of rules. At first, they dismissed me with laughter, but as the months passed, that laughter turned to nervous silence. The corruption was undeniable. Landscaping services that should have cost $10,000 were billed at $30,000. Administrative expenses ballooned with no explanation, paid to shell companies that turned out to be owned by relatives of the HOA president. Legal fees were padded, reserve funds depleted, and yet fines continued to rain down on homeowners for the smallest infractions. I documented everything. Every receipt, every check, every vote. I built a case so airtight that even their most low Yao supporters couldn't deny what was happening. But I didn't release it all at once. I let the information drip, little by little, each revelation eroding the trust between the board and the community. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, I continued to build alliances. Homeowners who once kept their heads down began to show up to meetings. They asked questions, demanded accountability, and most importantly, voted. For years, the board had thrived on apathy, but now, apathy was dead. People cared. People were angry. And they wanted change. When the next election cycle arrived, 2 more seats opened up. This time, I wasn't alone in running. I had encouraged 2 trusted neighbors, both victims of the board's bullying, to put their names forward. With the momentum we had built, the results were inevitable. Both won by overwhelming margins. Suddenly, the board was split. The old guard, once united in arrogance, now found themselves outnumbered by reformers. Their decisions were challenged, their contracts scrutinized, and their ability to operate unchecked was gone. For the first time in years, they weren't the hunters. They were the hunted. But I wasn't satisfied with a majority. I wanted total control. That's when I made my boldest move yet. For months, I had been quietly acquiring foreclosed properties in the neighborhood. Every house that slipped into delinquency became an opportunity. With each purchase, I gained another vote in the HOA, another slice of control. By the time anyone realized what I was doing, I owned 5 homes in Lakeside Meadows, 5 votes, 5 voices, and combined with my growing coalition, I held more influence than the board ever imagined. When the financial audit I had pushed for finally came back, it confirmed everything I had uncovered. Embezzlement, nepotism, misuse of funds. The evidence was irrefutable, and when it was presented at the annual meeting, the room erupted in outrage. Homeowners who had once cowered under the board's threats now shouted for resignations, demanding accountability for every stolen dollar. One by one, the old board members resigned under pressure. Some left quietly, others in a storm of denial and excuses, but the result was the same. Their empire had collapsed. The very people who had fined me for a flower pot were now packing up their offices in disgrace. And then, in a moment that felt almost surreal, I was elected HOA president. The power that had once been used to bully and extort was now in my hands. But unlike them, I wasn't interested in control for its own sake. I wanted justice. I wanted to make an example so clear, so brutal, that no future board would ever dare to abuse its authority again. My first act as president was to fire the management company that had enabled the corruption. Contracts were terminated, shady vendors were blacklisted, and new safeguards were put in place to prevent conflicts of interest. Transparency became the rule, not the exception. Every dollar spent was accounted for, every decision documented. Then came the reckoning. With the audit in hand, I referred the evidence to the State Attorney General's office. Investigations were launched, subpoenas issued, and former board members suddenly found themselves facing consequences they had never imagined. The smug smiles that had once greeted me at meetings were replaced with court summons and legal fees. Neighbors who had once whispered their frustrations now walked proudly down the street, free from harassment. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of community that had been buried for years. The HOA was no longer a weapon. It was what it was always meant to be. An organization that served the homeowners, not the other way around. And as for the flower pot, the one that started it all, I put it back on my porch. This time, no one dared to complain. Instead, people smiled when they saw it, knowing he's story behind it. It wasn't just a flower pot anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, of victory, of what happens when you refuse to be bullied. But even as I settled into my new role, I knew the story wasn't over. Taking control of the HOA was one thing. Keeping it was another. Power attracts ambition, and I knew there would always be those who sought to twist it for their own gain. The difference now was that I was ready. Because once you've fought an HOA and won, nothing else scares you. Taking control of the HOA had been a victory, but victory doesn't come without consequences. For years, the board had ruled through fear and intimidation, and now that their empire was dismantled, the debris was scattered across every corner of the community. Cleaning it up would take time, patience, and no small amount of resilience. The first shockwave came from the lawsuits. The former board members, desperate to save themselves, filed countersuits against the HOA and even against me personally. They claimed the audit was flawed, the elections rigged, and the accusations baseless. But the documents I had gathered told a different story. Bank statements, invoices, and contracts, all meticulously cataloged, made their defense crumble before it could even begin. Still, the legal process dragged on. The neighborhood found itself splashed across local headlines, painted as a cautionary tale of greed and mismanagement. Reporters camped outside the community center during hearings, eager to capture the downfall of people who once thought they were untouchable. For some neighbors, it was embarrassing. For others, it was vindication. At the same time, a deeper issue emerged. Trust. Years of abuse had left scars on the homeowners. Even after the corrupt board was gone, suspicion lingered like a heavy fog. People questioned every decision, every expense, every rule. They were tired of being deceived, and I couldn't blame them. To rebuild that trust, I introduced complete transparency. Every meeting was open and recorded. Every financial statement was published online for all to see. Homeowners were invited to vote on major decisions, not just the board. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't a shadowy cabal. It was a community effort. But transparency didn't come without friction. Some residents, empowered by their newfound voice, became louder than ever. Arguments erupted over budgets, landscaping, and maintenance projects. What had once been dictated from above was now a messy democracy, and messy meant conflict. Still, it was better than silence, better than tyranny. Meanwhile, the financial fallout of the previous board's corruption came into focus. Reserve funds were dangerously low, maintenance projects had been neglected, and service contracts were overpriced. The neighborhood's once pristine appearance was beginning to fray at the edges. Lawns went unkempt, paint peeled from fences, and potholes appeared in streets that hadn't been resurfaced in years. It would take money to fix it, and that meant raising dues. The announcement sparked outrage. After years of being squeezed for every dime, homeowners bristled at the thought of paying more. I understood their anger. But the truth was unavoidable. If we didn't act, the community would crumble. I stood in front of them at the annual meeting explaining where every dollar had gone, showing the receipts of theft and waste. I told them the truth, plain and unvarnished. And though it was met with groans and frustration, the majority approved the increase. Not because they trusted me completely yet, but because they knew they had no choice. Through it all, I kept one thing in mind: the flower pot. The simple, hand-painted pot that had started this entire war. It reminded me that this wasn't about money or power. It was about dignity, about a community that deserved better than to be ruled by tyrants. But not everyone read that view. Some of the former board members still lived in the neighborhood, their reputations in tatters, but their bitterness alive and well. They whispered rumors, tried to rally small groups against me, and painted me as a power-hungry dictator in disguise. To them, my takeover wasn't justice. It was revenge. And in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. Because I wasn't just rebuilding the HOA, I was making an example out of it. Every safeguard I put in place, every reform I enacted, every ounce of transparency I demanded was a message to them and to anyone else who might try to follow in their footsteps. Never again. The lawsuits eventually fizzled. The evidence was too strong, the corruption too blatant. Some of the former board members faced fines, others lost their jobs, and a few even faced criminal charges. The smug confidence they once wore like armor was gone, replaced with the hollow eyes of people who had lost everything. For the community, the fallout was mixed. Some neighbors celebrated openly, relieved that the bullies were finally gone. Others remained cautious, waiting to see if the new leadership would fall into the same traps. But slowly, cautiously, trust began to return. I watched children play in yards without fear of fines. I saw families decorate their homes for holidays without letters of complaint. I walked past lawns that weren't perfect, but no one cared anymore because the community wasn't about perfection. It was about people. And as for me, I found myself in a strange position. I hadn't set out to lead. I hadn't dreamed of running an HOA or managing community politics. All I had wanted was to protect a flower pot, to stand up to bullies. But now, here I was, the head of an association that had once tried to ruin me. It was ironic, almost poetic. But the story wasn't finished. The community was healing, but slowly. The scars of corrupt on and abuse don't fade overnight. And deep down, I knew that as long as power existed, someone would try to abuse it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. The difference now was that I was ready, because I hadn't just beaten the HOA. I had become the HOA. And I would make sure no one forgot what happened to those who crossed the line. The war that began with a flower pot had finally come to an end. The HOA was no longer a weapon wielded by a few power-hungry neighbors, but a community effort shaped by the very people it once sought to control. The transformation hadn't been quick, and it certainly hadn't been painless, but as the months turned into years, the legacy of what had happened began to take shape. At first, the victory felt hollow. The corrupt board members had been ousted, the lawsuits settled, and transparency established, but the emotional weight of the battle lingered. I would wake up at night remembering the letters slipped under my door, the fines that stacked higher and higher, the sense of helplessness I once felt when I stood alone against an entire system designed to break me. Those scars remained, even as life returned to normal. But slowly, the victories began to outshine the memories. The neighborhood that once lived in fear started to breathe again. Families decorated their homes without hesitation. Seasonal displays, garden gnomes, and holiday lights appeared like bursts of color after a long winter. Children rode bikes in the streets, shouting and laughing, no longer silenced by the threat of complaints. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced with something that had been missing for far too long: joy. Financially, the community began to stabilize. With fair contracts negotiated and funds properly managed, reserves grew, and long-neglected repairs were finally addressed. Roads were repaved, sidewalks restored, and the pool that had been closed for years reopened, becoming a gathering place for families once more, the pride in ownership returned, not because people were forced into uniformity, but because they finally felt their homes were truly theirs. And through it all, I remained at the center, not because I sought recognition, but because people trusted me to keep the promises I had made. At every meeting, homeowners reminded me of what we had endured together, and I reminded them that the HOA was theirs now, not mine. Transparency became more than just a rule. It became a culture. Yet, even as peace settled over the neighborhood, the question lingered. What did it all mean? Because this wasn't just about a flower pot. It wasn't even just about one HOA. It was about power, about control, and about what happens when people stop questioning those who claim authority over them. My story became a cautionary tale, whispered in other neighborhoods, shared online, and discussed in forums where frustrated homeowners vented about their own battles. I started receiving messages from strangers in other states, people who had stumbled across the story and found courage in it. They asked how I had done it, how I had fought back, how they could reclaim their communities from boards that had forgotten what they were supposed to be. And every time, I told them the truth. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, and it came at a cost. But it was possible. The irony never escaped me. I had once been just another homeowner, fined for something as small as a flower pot. Now I was seen as the person who had taken down an HOA and rebuilt it from the ground up. Some people called me a hero, others a troublemaker, and a few still whispered that I was no different than those I had removed. But in the end, labels didn't matter. What mattered was the change. The former board members, for all their arrogance and cruelty, faded into obscurity. Some moved away, unable to face the community they had once ruled. Others stayed, living quietly, stripped of their influence. A few faced legal consequences they never thought would reach them. Their empire had crumbled, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that had once surrounded them. As for me, I found myself reflecting on the strange path my life had taken. I hadn't chosen this fight. It had been forced upon me. But in fighting it, I had discovered something important, that even against impossible odds, one person could make a difference. That standing up, even for something as simple as a flower pot, could spark a revolution. Years later, when I walked past that same spot in my yard, the flower pot still sat there, weathered, chipped, its colors faded, but still standing. It wasn't just a decoration anymore. It was a monument, a reminder of what had been lost, what had been won, and what it had taken to get there. Neighbors would sometimes stop and point at it, smiling knowingly. New homeowners, unaware of its significance, would ask why I kept such an old, worn thing on display, and every time I would tell them the story. Not because I enjoyed reliving the battle, but because I wanted them to understand that freedom in a community isn't free, it must be defended. The HOA had tried to break me with fines and threats. Instead, it had forged me into something stronger. And while I never asked for that role, I carried it proudly. In the end, the legacy wasn't about me. It wasn't even about the HOA. It was about the people, the families who had endured, the neighbors who had stood together, the community that had rediscovered its voice. It was about proving that no matter how small the fight seemed, no matter how overwhelming the opposition appeared, justice was possible. And as I looked out across the neighborhood, watching the children play, the families gather, and the homes shine with life, I realized something. The flower pot had started it, but the people had finished it, and that was the true victory.